or you have to go back and see what's going on, they've got that as an option. Okay. So we're trying to figure out if we can get this to display, but either way we'll be all right. Okay, so can you tell us who's online?
Yes, we have Deborah Palmer, Janae Oberson, Christine, and Pam Stevens.
All right, so welcome to all of them. And Norma, anytime there's a chat or a comment that needs to come up from them, we'll make sure that we get that in. So remind me again, Deborah?
Yes, Pam, Christine, Janae, and Deborah.
Great.
Sorry, I missed that.
Okay, yeah.
Same again, I missed it.
That's all right.
And I'll keep track of them for you, Robert.
All right, so we're gonna have Jennifer keep trying to figure out how to make this thing work. So I'm gonna kind of walk through, as a reminder, just to kind of let you know the purpose and goal for this, both for this group and then for, and just kind of the general timeline for standards work. The Standards Review Committee is the Kickstarter. Think of yourselves as the group that says, first of all, looking at existing standards, should they be revised or not? So that's the first question. If the standards, in your opinion, feel like they need to be revised, then the next step is, what's the charge? What is the charge, the mandate for the board to consider, and then for the writing teams to consider regarding what those standards should look like? So a charge might be something like, I'll just use Wendy as an example. Wendy's written comments, and we've got a few, I made a few hard copies. There are about 5 hard copies that I sent around. And we've all got that. You all have the Google Doc. You all have that documentation as well there. But Wendy had a kind of a summary statement that could be seen as a charge, okay? And we'll take a look at that in a moment. There you go. Ta-da! Nice work. Great. Thank you. All right. So basically, the process is we have a timeline for when standards are reviewed. The board has approved a standards review committee. Your membership is identified by the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, or from the board. You come together and you make a recommendation or not regarding standards revision. Then if there's a cause for revision, then the following steps will be executed, okay? A writing committee is organized, draft standards are ready for release, there's a 90-day public review, there's a revised draft of standards, there's a full board opportunity for review and feedback, there's a final draft review, and then we submit not only that draft, but also a plan for how to implement those standards to the board. For example, if Wendy's recommendation about encouraging 45 minutes a day of social studies instruction in the elementary grades, well, how's that going to happen? Because the reality is, it's not happening. There's very minimal social studies instruction occurring in elementary schools across the state. So that would be a piece of number 12, would be an implementation plan. Make sense? One of the really critical things to remember is that this process from the get-go is open and as transparent as possible, and that there are multiple points of entry for people to have their say and to have a feedback loop so that we can feel confident that the standards we create regarding social studies in Utah reflect what we want for kids. And how do we best prepare them to be civically engaged, ready to have a curious, fascinating, excited life? And that's the bottom line. That's what we want. So your job right now is merely to say whether we have cause to review and revise the standards, okay? As you think about that, you need to think about, are the standards that we have in existence providing an adequate foundation to successfully pursue college, technical education, a career, or other life pursuits? And I love the fact that there are other life pursuits there. So who knows what the future is going to hold for these students, right? And our task is to consider, are the standards that we have currently good enough? Or do they need a major revision? Do they need a minor revision? Do they need a connection? As another example that Wendy talked about is connecting K2 to 3.6 in a more seamless, kind of consistent way. So that's your job. That's all you have to do. It does not mean you cannot be a part of opportunities in the future to have conversation and input. But you didn't sign on to be the writing team. We're not asking you to do that, okay? What we're asking you to do is to make a recommendation today that says, move forward or not, okay? Any questions about that? Yep.
I love Wendy's statement that we should advance social studies and do 45 minutes a day. But I see that as being something very different from the standards be revised. Can you just clarify our view on that?
Sure. Good question. So I'm just going to repeat the question because I'm not sure everybody heard it. So Pam's point was, there's a recommendation to encourage consistent teaching of the standards for 45 minutes a day, which is, a lot of states across the country are trying to encourage that. And how is that connected to this standards work? Kind of tangentially, two things. One is that it's connected in this way. If we say we want robust, strong standards in social studies moving forward, that's our recommendation, your committee recommendation, then possibly the only way that is to occur is if there's significant amounts of time every day in classes for that to occur, okay? So it might inform how your recommendation regarding the structure of the standards, but you're right in that they're not linked. There's not a linkage. We have to assume local control. We have to assume that some schools devote far more time, maybe. Maybe they integrate social studies concepts throughout the day. Maybe there might be in the future elementary schools that have a history focus, for example. Let's say Jordan wants to pilot some school. We wouldn't want them to be hamstrung by just 45 minutes, okay? But that's the kind of concept. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay. I want to remind you that there's standards and then there's curriculum. Okay, so just a reminder that standards identify basic knowledge, skills, and competencies that each student is expected to acquire or master, that they increase in depth and complexity from year to year. So another mandate from us might be to make sure that the writers put in place developmentally appropriate standards at each grade level, right? So if there are some comments where it's like, well, I'm not sure if they're ready for that at that grade level, then you would say, devoid from specificity to a specific standard, you would say, we mandate, or we recommend that the writers create standards that pay attention to developmental appropriateness, which we better hope they would, of course, right? The curriculum is then how that's taught. What's the grain size, the day-to-day unit, the lesson on Rosa Parks or George Washington Carver that's going to exemplify the standard, which is at a bigger chunk, okay? So when we define a standard in Utah, it's an articulation of the demonstrated proficiency to be obtained. A standard is the essential element of the learning that's expected. Okay? So in social studies, we have these disciplines. We have history, we have geography, we have civics or political science, and we have economics as the four biggies in the field. We also have anthropology. So the study of archaeology and anthropology and how people have worked, that's still a beautiful aspect and could be an aspect of a Utah Studies course, for example. And a recommendation might be, please pay attention in these standards to the unique local history that we have and the local culture that we have, including the vast resources, both historically, prehistorically, and currently, right? We have psychology. Psychology in case 6, not so much. Although even psychology and economics are very often tied in terms of like why people make the choices they make about whether they're going to buy yet another Pokemon card or whatever. Although I don't think those are cool anymore, but you know what I mean, right? Sociology, the study of how it is that people and groups work together. So those are the disciplines. I passed out and sent you this as well, this conversation about the marginalization of social studies that's a real concern nationwide in terms of, like why are we even meeting if the reality is very little social studies instruction occurring in K-6. So one argument, and I have to tell you, I've my horse isn't in the race here. This is your committee decision. But one thing to consider is, will a revision of standards focus attention on social studies in a way that will help kind of alleviate some of the marginalization of social studies? So that's just something to consider, okay? I also brought up last time the Utah Portrait of a Graduate and the indicators in particular that very often tie back to social studies, including, as was mentioned in our last meeting, the fact that academic mastery alone has a huge impact on student success, and student success in many of these other areas as well, okay? But a charge may be pay attention to, when possible, indicators within the Portrait of a Graduate. For example, civic and economic and political or financial economic literacy is a piece there. You may want to make a recommendation that if digital literacy, which can include how do you sort out fact from fiction on social media, is that something that students ought to be able to learn how to do when they're in 6th grade or 5th grade, okay? So that, again, may be a recommendation. The good news is you don't have to think of everything in terms of recommendations, because it's not like the writers and the writing team aren't going to also have been thinking about these issues, okay? So last meeting, I wanted you to think about the research that we know, the work, many of you are methods professors. There's 3 methods professors in this group. Janae's on the line from BYU. I wanted you to think about the Portrait of a Graduate. I wanted you to think about the content, the skills, the dispositions. How is it that public education can help inspire creativity and curiosity and inquiry and empathy? These are not bad, these are not bad things, okay? So what is it, how is it that we can support that? Are there things that need to be taken out? Are there, and again, you're flying over at 50,000 feet. I really want to, first of all, appreciate the work that people did looking specifically at specific standards, because it speaks volumes about how much they care about this subject and about their kids. Then the question is to kind of step back and say, okay, what are the themes that we see here that we want to make sure, if you move forward with revision, you want to make sure that writers address? Does that make sense? Okay. And then any other aspects you want to include? Okay. So your homework for today was to read the standards again. Are there essential parts? Are there things that are missing? Are there things thinking about beginning with the end in mind in terms of we work at the board, which means it's the vision of the board, which means that's how we operate as a state public education agency, is to think about what are those qualities and dispositions and skills that a graduate is going to have when they walk or roll their way across the stage and get that diploma? And how then does social studies help that? Are there logical connections across grades? So a recommendation might be that the writers pay attention to the natural connections between science and social studies at different grade levels, or mathematics and social studies, or the arts and social studies. That there are ways that we can then encourage integration as we move forward. Okay, so that was your homework. And your job today is to think out loud and think about what recommendations you want to make with these kinds of things informing your ideas. And that's it. Then you're done. You can just drop the mic and be proud of your work and go do whatever else you need to do, because it's not a busy time of year or anything. Okay, so what questions do you have to this point?
Jump in.
Oh, and will you introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
Allison Bench. I was here last meeting.
Yep.
So I was like,
No, you're fine. And Allison, remind me of where your kids are.
they're in Alpine.
In Alpine, great. Yep.
I just had a question about, so I know.
Pam, will you send that down to Allison so everyone can hear? Here's the top. So Norma will bring it down.
So I understand our role as the standards committee is the overview and just to see if we even want to review or go forward. My question will be, down the road, if we do decide to review, how does that also affect what kind of testing they're going to implement or need to put in place? And what is that going to look like for budgeting and all that? I know that's not in our scope right now, but that's just I'm just curious if they're going to have to reinvent and add more testing so that then we know how the students are learning more. So that's kind of my question.
Maybe push one domino.
Yeah.
Does anybody, I'm not the only expert here. Does somebody want to talk about testing in elementary grades? I will.
I really don't know. I truly don't understand.
Okay, someone just grab the talking stick back.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it's fine.
Order a new machine that you would
That'd be nice. Great. All
for your meeting, but
right. So the short answer is there's no standardized assessment of social studies at all, K-12.
That's what I understood. So
Right. So however, I can't predict the future. It seems like the trend is towards less standardized testing rather than more. So I can't see that there would be a call for more assessment of social studies, for example, in elementary grades. If that were to be the case, the existing standards, I can say, would be very difficult to assess. I just want you to think about that in terms of when you say something like students will understand something. It's like, well, okay, you're all nodding, so you all get it. Okay, it's my formative assessment. But in terms of the reason why social studies is not, why there aren't statewide assessments in social studies was because in many ways, social studies people came together years ago and said, we don't want it. We don't want to add one more assessment. The second thing is it's very easy to do the kind of lowest common denominator of assessment, which is going to be the names and dates and things that students will remember only until Friday when the quiz happens, and they won't remember on Monday. And that's not what we want. My second caveat is that social studies is also assessed all the time in all the other standardized assessments, especially in their language arts. That what we want to do is have reading, writing, speaking, and listening occurring. We want deep background knowledge taught so kids know about the world so they can be successful on other assessments like English. Okay? But in terms of the cost, there was a question as well from one of our members asking specifically about how much, if we were to do a revision, what are the taxpayers on the hook for? This would be a relatively low-cost revision in comparison to other disciplines because there's no assessment tied. If the recommendation is to keep a revision within the existing kind of grade bands or the kind of content areas, then instructional materials costs could be minimal. The instructional materials costs at present are pretty minimal. I think some of the district people can say that the outlay of resources into social studies at this point is pretty minimal. The time for paying writers to come in is where the bulk of the cost would be, and that would be, I would say, probably between $20,000 and $50,000, which is, I mean, seriously, not a lot of money in terms of this work for statewide standards. Okay. Great. What other questions?
So there isn't a standard for social studies, but once you get into high school and you're taking history, your government classes, then you have stuff, but it's just not the general social studies, correct?
No, there are no tests in high school either. No standardized.
Oh, not state level, okay. I see.
None of the
There's just
state
classroom
level.
level.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, classroom level. Right.
This-
District benchmarks, things like that, but not statewide tests.
Gotcha.
The only exception to that is the high school graduation requirement of a civics test that's patterned after the naturalization test. Okay? All right. What other questions? Okay. Yep, please.
I normally have lots to say, but I have lots to learn, so I will participate, but I'm kind of in a learning mode at this point.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, there's nothing as valuable as someone who knows when to be quiet, you know? I need to learn that, so thank you. Okay, so really, I mean, that's it. In terms of my PowerPoint, that's it. What we need to do now as a committee is think about what's the process you want to make. I can throw up a Google document. You have the comments that people have made, kind of thematic ideas. You can make as many or as few recommendations to the board regarding the next step as you'd like. So,
I guess I do have a question. I actually read through, maybe you can hear me, I actually speak loud most of the time. I read these comments or these outlines of Deborah Palmer's, and each time I read each one, I was extremely pleased with the conscientiousness, because it's my understanding we're not here, we don't want the state to be doing social engineering. We want the state to be in its place of helping. We benefit from an educated society, and that education, the further the parents are away from the children, what they're learning, the more it's a deficit. And so that's my concern about any kind of state mandate or regulation is that the parents need to be as close to what their kids are learning as possible. And I'm afraid that direction reduces that closeness.
okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I think parents are essential, so I don't think there's any argument there.
Some of our standards, when we start doing the supports, are things that, how can we engage families in these discussions so that it's not what we're hearing at school, but how is our family going to influence or at least support us in understanding civic engagement and such. And so thinking about that, one of your recommendations might be around how do we engage families in the conversations to make sure that you have the parental role that you would like to serve in that setting as an opportunity.
That was actually one recommendation that I had thought of, and I'm not sure how we're, like, what's the process like? Do we have a whiteboard, like writing down, or just on the Google Docs? But I think one thing that I did notice, and I did not have so much time to study out the 3rd through 6th, so say speed was more K through 2, but really because the family and the home is their world at that time, and it just seemed like family and home could be incorporated a lot more into that because they don't really have a world vision outside of that, and I didn't see that as much in their relationship to their family, to their home, to their school was kind of implied, but I'd like to see that a little bit more because I think if they can really get that relationship, then they can start relating it out as they get older into the community. And
Yeah, how are you determining how we're making it work?
Yeah, what we'll do is, as soon as I can get Outlook to pop up here, or we could just within the Google Doc or however, so you can all see it.
don't need to take notes. We would.
Once this decides to project again.
We'll get there. Technology.
Well, we can have a discussion while he's getting that, but I just had a question as far as like, if we do have ideas, like once this meeting is over, is that it? We can't still submit things, or do we have like the end of the day? Like,
So the recommendations go to the board, and so ultimately these will go in January, and they'll make the decision based on those recommendations in January, so it's kind of.
so we have a little bit of time. to
Yeah, so I mean,
get
that's ultimately, he has to produce a document by next.
So I have a board memo that goes in today, and that memo is the first information, and then we'd have board backup, and the board backup is the report from this committee, okay? The recommendations. So summary, we met twice, these are the dates we met, here are the people who attended, here are the links to the meetings, and here are the recommendations, okay? So you'll have time during this, if other things come up, as long as as long as we have a consensus. It's easier if we just did it now. I mean, it'd just be a lot easier if you can think of, but again, what I want to reiterate is, while this is the beginning of, possibly the beginning of the process, it's not the end of the opportunity for people to give feedback, okay? It's just, are we revising or not? That's the first question, right?
I mean, we do this with every standards, right? So social studies is just the current one up. We have preschool that's almost done, but it's going through the public review process. So we go out to public meetings and meet with whoever wants to come. We have the online survey that people get to give additional feedback. So it's a constant iterative process. Ultimately, this group is the broad themes. What are the broad ideas that need to be encompassed in the revision so that as the writers go to do the revision, they consider your recommendations as part of that work. So it's really the broad ideas. It's not getting down to the standards level. Standards level would be if you want to join the writing committee, where you really get down to the nitty-gritty of each line and have a great time. It's a lot of work and lots of days. It's many hours that go into the actual standards revision. But this group is really ultimately about the broad strokes. What are the themes? What are the intentions that this group would like to see in the further iterations of the standards? Because this is probably at least the second or third time they've been revised, maybe more. We generally revise every 7 years, so you don't have to feel like what you did today is going to be lifetime. It's good for about 7 years, and then we go through the same process again at this point. So it's really about being current. When was the last time these were revised?
So actually, Steve was a part of it.
Okay.
The first time, because I came on staff about the first time we did the 3.6, I think it was like 2005, 2006, right?
You're on a 7-year cycle now, so you don't have to feel like you have to live with these for a whole childhood of raising. We're on a 7-year cycle of the board now, so every 7 years, standards become revised. So once these actually go live in 2020, 2021, then in 2027 or 2028, we will go through the same process again. So you can imagine your youth will make it through, and then if you have new babies, they will get the new standards, kind of just for future generations. So just thinking about that, it's really the broad strokes. What are the big ideas that need to come about in the standards that aren't presently there? So I think that homeschool connection in the early grades, making sure that's strong, might be a very purposeful recommendation, and it doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of how. It's just, this is what we want, and leave that to the writing committee to figure out what that looks like. And then your future feedback is really through that survey process around, here's, oh, you did this, but I would also like to see this. That's those opportunities. And we do really take the public feedback very seriously in our revisions. So it's quite a bit of work to do standards. It takes a couple of years. You'll see this will take another year after your committee to actually probably have official standards. The actual writing committees take about 6 months of work, meeting pretty frequently.
So Jennifer's the board looking for like a specific number of like, recommendations?
We've had people come back and say, they're good. In this particular case, I think these have been long enough sitting that it's time for a refresh from what I'm gathering from you all. But it's time, but there's not a specific number. So you also don't want to inundate, because the writing, you want to say what are the most important, so the writing committee can really focus on those. It's just like anything in your lives. If you have a list of 20 things to do versus 5,
if you can get the source to
quality
just
gets better.
get my computer
than the
projecting
quantity. So
again.
being thoughtful about prioritizing your needs.
For the H29.
Yeah, it just needs to,
For different.
What do you mean?
it just needs to be displaying again. It's not displaying. And then what I've got is, I have a Word doc. I'll just pull up.
See? It might just be, let's try this. Like it's connected, right? Let's just try that for a second. Here we go.
Thank you.
Robert,
Deborah's wondering who's on the writing committee.
We don't have a writing, so good question. So Deborah asked, who's on the writing committee? We don't have a writing committee. We don't have a writing committee because we don't know whether we're writing them or not. So we haven't created the writing team
And the
until.
other intention of that is your recommendations help to determine what kind of writing committee members we need. So if we need people strong in the home family connection, that broadens our typical scope. So a classroom teacher, some of them are really great at that, some may not be. But thinking about our partners that we partner with in education of how they might be able to help us see that. So your recommendations ultimately help to drive the composition of that writing committee. Thinking about what are the skill sets we need coming into the group rewrite.
Christine has a comment.
Yeah.
If we're only recommending whether or not to revise the standards, but will not be involved in the revision, how do we know that we won't get something worse?
You will be able to participate in public comment. It's not, this group is intended to be the group that gives the recommendations, and then a different group of well-qualified people, as yourselves here, are then work on the writing. So
Yeah.
I would hate to undermine the value of the people we hire moving forward. They have been skilled in the past standards, and are there always revisions or things that could have been better? Any work that you do has constant, like, oh, I wish we would have written it this way. But we take pride in the people we hire to do these things, so I hope
And
you
they
can
will
trust
take,
that.
they will take our recommendations under consideration. So whatever we
Yes, they have
recommend,
to.
they will say, oh, the committee wanted to focus more on the family connection. So
Yep.
they will do that.
Yes, so that's their requirement. So the whole point of this is not to say, well, you recommend it, we're not going to do it. The intent is that your recommendations occur, and then we are able to articulate how they're represented in the new standards.
Deborah also says we should be able to review the revision in order to give consensus.
You sure can, just like the rest of the public.
Yeah, I mean, you will. It's just that I want to be clear about your role. Do we revise or not, and what should it look like? Period.
So are we in consensus that we want to revise?
That's a great place to start.
Because I think we're ready to make that decision
Right.
as a committee.
Should we go one at a time and just talk about things that we have seen as we have taken a look at the standards and then after the statement? I don't know if we're ready to talk about it right now.
Well, let's take a vote. If everybody's a yes, then we move forward and make everyone's recommendations, right?
Right, I mean, I think.
This is a great democratic
So
You know-
our understanding was we had chosen to revise this last thing.
Yes.
And so that was the consensus.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it seemed generally like it was a consensus. We've got new people who are able to be physically in this space, but does it seem like this is like a formative assessment, right? It's like,
Those in favor, aye?
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
right? So,
There we go.
if you feel like the standards need to be revised.
I feel like at least the consensus based on the structure and the format, I mean, as far as the big brushstroke, format and simplification on both K through 6, that would be, I think, everybody's number one. I saw Peggy, like, on all those comments. So to simplify the standard, like, in that format.
It's just a
A
little more
Kiston.
consistent in how they are.
So
Yeah.
let's keep this to one. The agreement right now or on the table is to revise or not revise, and then we can think about.
Okay, perfect.
The why is what your recommendations are. Here's why we consider the need for revision. So at this point, I saw mostly thumbs up, I saw a couple non-participation.
Yeah, I'm just not educated enough to.
I appreciate that, you're a neutral party right now.
It's fine.
And he's gonna take the lead of all of you to say, okay, I can get on board and.
Geography's important, and you can be Switzerland, so it's fine.
Not very long, you can't do that very long.
Right.
That's right.
All right, so the current social studies standard should be revised. That's a recommendation.
Yes.
Okay.
So-
And now we're open to other possibilities. So Brenda, we're happy
When
to.
we say revise, I want to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel. That revision, it's a revision versus throwing everything out and starting over.
So what I'd like you to think about then is how can you positively, affirmatively say that? Try to think about a way that you could say that, and we can. I'm not putting you on the spot, Brenda, to say this is how you should say it, but think about, because it does seem like I'm hearing that from a number of people that they like the bulk of what is here. So the current social standards should be revised is one recommendation. Another recommendation might be what?
Well, I have a simple one, and I don't know if I'm jumping the gun, but I definitely think we need to make sure there's equity when we're looking at descriptors as far as, I'm thinking of K through 2, but I know that it goes further as far as male dominant descriptions that we have. In the, I think, I can't remember, first or second grade, they talk about community members or learning, and most of those are male-dominant jobs that they're talking about. The policeman, the fireman, and I didn't see a real sense of equality in the descriptions. And so, I mean, that would be something that, I don't know if that's a simple, just keeping in mind or being intentional on when they're writing to make sure that they are including.
Be inclusive.
Be inclusive.
Yes. And maybe one way to do this, because all of your hands are up, maybe we just go around and you give one feedback. We're not going to say anything, it's just neutrality, and then we can do some voting around what everyone can agree to, because you may totally disagree with Brenda, I think it was. And you need to be able to have that voice in this group. And ultimately, the recommendations we come out with are the ones that we feel most of us can get behind, and we can say that we had a couple of other ideas that some felt, but the group was not in consensus. And we can still represent your idea to the board, but because they might say, well, we feel strongly about that too. So the board can also make recommendations through your recommendations, if that makes sense.
Right.
So would that work for your style? Is that okay? And we can go to you next and give us an idea.
Just really quick with that, just because when a thought came to me, like my daughter is in second grade, and they did just talk about community helpers. And I think a lot of that also comes down to what is the curriculum that people are going to choose to do with that, because, and that's not even in our scope. So we don't really have, we don't know what that's going to be, because my daughter came home and they learned about community helpers, but she had a picture of a woman fireman. So, I mean, I think it really is locally kind of good. It's up to the teacher at this point. So we have to also keep that in mind, that we don't really, in this committee, have a say of what the curriculum is.
Correct.
So we have to do it in a way that, if we don't want that, then we have to word it in a way that the standards encompass that, or if we do want that, we have to, so anyways.
Hold on just a second.
Okay.
I'm trying to meet the technological desires of the people online. So what?
This is another benefit of sending the mic in order.
Yeah, so we're going to do that in a second, but Deborah Palmer wants to be able to be heard. So what I'm going to ask is, Deborah, if you could send your phone number, what I can do is call you, so you can, we'll put you on speakerphone so you can hear and chime in whenever you need to. Okay?
I just wanted to say Wendy's statement from the Google Doc, where she talks about the content being inclusive and respectful of the full range of historical experiences. I think she's written it very well. So that recommendation is already there.
So going back to Brenda, since you put that on the table, does that represent your idea?
It's here on it's this comment right here.
I see that. And, well, if we're going to be neutral, I'll wait until it's.
Okay, we can just put it on the table for now.
Right. I think everyone needs to be heard.
Love it. Can we maybe just pass the mic and share one idea, and we'll come back if you have multiple ideas, so this way everyone gets a voice before we get. And then if yours gets taken, you're like, cha-cha. And or if you want to hand it off to her, and then they can just pass, so you don't have to be there.
I guess my main recommendation would be, one, to simplify the way that they're implemented, the standards, and that it does need to be more cohesive and congruent through the whole grade levels. But I also think that the children are capable of knowing things younger than we think, such as the preamble, or, I mean, my preschooler learned that in preschool. I think that there's a lot more that our children can be learning, and it can add upon itself each year, as long as we're making standards that are all congruent and in the same strand of thought. Hopefully that makes sense, but
And the
I,
skills,
and the
too, that we're asking
skills.
them to do.
I do, my concern, one of my concerns was the, not the marginalization, is this one with the portrait of a graduate. We can have these ideals, but I also think that, kind of how Mr. Austin was saying, that even with language arts, they're going to be getting, how can we implement that so that the teacher doesn't feel so stressed out trying to put that extra time to social studies? I mean, this is my favorite subject, and so it's hard to see, my students aren't getting history. So I think if we can integrate it with the other subjects in a way that's easier for teachers to implement, that would be my suggestion.
Great, let me ask a couple clarifying points to make sure I understand today, right? One, you've got to see
But
what's
hold on,
in the best.
because we do have people who really want to hear everything, and so I don't think,
Did that work?
unless they have the mic, I just don't think they'll be able to hear, so.
It says the battery is
It's like
low.
Oprah.
It says the battery is low.
Okay.
May not work too much.
Alex, do you have more batteries for this? It's just getting low. All right, so just to kind of reiterate how I simplified that into just some key ideas, but simplify implementation of the standards with content integration supports. And what I mean by that is trying to find those connections into other content areas so social studies does get taught. As an elementary teacher, it's a lot to try and hit across the school day, and so finding somehow for the writing review community to think about how do we make these connecting points where it is ELA integration can happen, or mathematics or science or any other content area our teachers are expected to teach. Is that right? Okay. But simplify, can you give me a little bit more there? Because I was like, what? That might mean something different to me than you're intending.
I think,
Like, is it quantity? Is it like?
I mean, as much as we can teach, I mean, each kid will gather what they can. But looking at the standards, it's very spelled out already. And I think that that's really good, but at the same time, even if we spell it out, the teachers are still going to get to choose and pick which things they, especially if there isn't standardized testing, which I'm not exactly for, over statewide. I think the teachers should have more local control. But I think, it's hard to explain this. I hadn't gathered my thoughts completely, so.
Take a moment,
Yeah.
because I just want to make sure
I think
we
simplify.
understand the intent of simplify, because
Yeah.
my impression usually is less standards
Yeah.
or consolidate standards or less topics. So that's my impression, and if that's not
Yeah.
what you're looking for, I want to make sure I don't represent the wrong idea in my mind.
No, that's perfect. I think not less standards necessarily, but less strands, or less,
So more focused.
more integrated with, I mean, because they all go together. It's just how do you go from one to the next, and how many should we have?
And then in
So-
teacher speak, we call it a vertical alignment, so
Yeah.
from grade to grade to grade.
Yeah.
So seeing those connecting points across the grades, they kind of build on each other, is what I also heard
Yeah.
from you. I
There-
don't
there
know
is-
if my language speaks your language all the time.
No, that was good. I think that, like Massachusetts has I think it's vertical alignment, where they have, I think that that's a very good thing to look at as far as how we're developing this as
Right.
it goes forward.
And that's our health standards,
So-
like you learn this in K, and if you didn't get that in K, the first grade standard is going to be a little harder. So it
Yeah.
kind of puts a little more onus on the teachers to make sure those are being taught.
But I also, and against that, I do like kind of more of a spiral approach too, where you review and then you go back.
And
So-
usually they do, so they'll build on it a couple years later, so you get kind of this intro point maybe in kindergarten, and then in second grade we build on that introduction with the next kind of layer.
Yeah,
You don't
now
wanna leave
is
it
the-
behind, it doesn't get mastered the first
Yeah,
time.
so now how I understand it is they'll learn it maybe in kindergarten and then not again until fourth.
Which is
So
probably
it's
a
a little
little
bit of
too
a,
far.
yeah, so I like the idea of going
A little more
closer.
frequent.
Yeah, yeah.
In that expansion. Do you want to add to this under vertical alignment with
Kind of, what do we call that, spiral approach, like a review?
Yeah, that includes the spiral.
I don't know how, it's kind of how like Saxon math does, where they,
It
you
keeps
learn it
coming
and
back.
then it comes back. and
It's
it's-
recursive, that's it. Robert's really good with
Thank
words.
you.
The former English teacher comes in handy. And then the last part was just that development of the appropriate, but not limiting what we think kids can do, but making sure we consider that they probably can do more than they do fast. Okay, so it's a rigor.
Yeah.
So I just want to point of, just a quick point.
I'll just stay here.
Okay, so just a point of process, right? So the only thing that's bold right now is the top recommendation. Everything else, we'll look at all of these in a moment. We'll get it all out, brainstorming it all out. What I'd ask is anyone online, and Norma, if you can kind of put this in the chat, anyone online who has specific recommendations they want to add in the same kind of format, please do so in the chat and we can add them in. Because when you're stuck in Box Elder with 16 inches of snow, I don't want you to feel like you're not welcomed, okay? Does that make sense? All right, thanks.
All right. I think, I mean, I've already mentioned the overarching brushstroke of connecting, especially the younger kids to their home and family. The other thing that I saw throughout the K-12 is, and this is developmentally, but that particular age are very selfless and very interested in other people. And one thing that we talk about in the financial literacy standards don't include anything about what kids can do to add to home economies or in like what they can contribute, and just adding little vocabulary like giving or nonprofit, or just so that they have that awareness, so that they're not just making money to buy their own family needs, but they're actually, there's other reasons to earn money, and that they can contribute in a non-financial way to their family economy, their community economy, and kind of build on that, because I think that particular age group is really good at that, and I think to validate that on a sweeping scale would be, I think, really helpful, because that's their mode. When you get into 7th and beyond, that's when they're more the real financial literacy. But I know a lot of classrooms have their little classroom bucks and all that they're learning. But I think that's an important element that I think our community as Utahns really values, and I think that could be something that's added. The other thing that goes along with Brenda's is just increased vocabulary. I feel like there's a lot of little things, and I put them in there that they can learn. I think if there's anything else that just was over, those are kind of the overarching sweeps that I thought of, along with the formatting, because I love K through 2 formatting, and it's simple to keep that consistent, and it's not necessarily major content change, it's just consistency and some, yeah.
Okay, my name is Byron Tuck, for those that aren't here. Okay, the advantage of this group is that we bring many different aspects, okay? Just for your information, I grew up with an extremely abusive alcoholic family. I spent my whole life trying to figure out what right is. I've got 9 kids, I've adopted 2. I've had some that have made very bad choices, and as I think of social studies, I think to myself, there are unfortunately many families out there that don't have access to what we call common sense, or things that are common, because things that are common today are different than they were in the 1950s. And so my overall view is, what can we do without, I've got a deep concern, especially through Common Core and things of social engineering and some of the sexual standards that have been implemented, even the resources that are available to the teachers are very concerning to me. However, in an outline, in a big picture type thing, I'd like to see us lean towards a patriotism, because frankly, those that learn of where they belong and how they belong, and that includes matter of fact, I will say immigrants are some of our best Americans. They know the most, they're the best educated, and they're the most stalwart, yeah. And so this is in no way, this includes everyone. And the beauty of it is as we include that as an overview, it does include everyone that's in this country that has the opportunities that are afforded them. And I'd like to see kind of an overall of these basic standards, whether it's economic. So many times we find that the things that are the most valuable are are the things that are neglected in school, and then we see teachers that are leaning towards extremes and things they've got no business teaching about. And that's where my concerns are, is I'd like a general patriotism and standard common sense criteria that adds to our commonalities instead of detracts from them, if that makes sense.
Thanks. I loaded mine on this morning, so they didn't make it on the printed version, my comments. But generally, I agreed with Wendy's comments about the inclusion we brought up. So we already kind of covered that. And then more,
Put a tally mark.
what's that?
Put a tally mark. So you know.
Okay, yeah, you put a tally mark there. And then I'm recommending using an inquiry arc lens to start reorganizing the standards. Students will get different data sources and develop their own conclusions on different perspectives on a historical or contemporary questions. It's the direction that nationally we're going, and there's lots of models for it used in elementary schools. And I put it in my comments if people want to look it up more, but it's mainly teaching students how to be social scientists rather than being consumers of information.
Okay,
So they would be historians by looking at primary sources, and it's already happening in classrooms, but to make it more part of the structure of teaching them those skills.
Can I just make a comment about that, about Steve's comment?
Do you-
So I just wanted to say that, especially with our elementary teachers, we would have to provide them some documents. Our teachers will not or don't have the time to find a lot of those on their own. So if we include that, I would love to see a committee put together that can provide just not everything, because students need to do that, find some of that as well. But from my experience, when students go looking for primary sources, they end up with things they can't understand. So we need to put together some really good, here's where you go. Go to this website. Here are some things that have already been transcribed into typing rather than the handwriting itself, so that students can really look at them and make sense of them. But teachers don't have the time to do all that on their own. So we need to make sure that if that's our recommendation, that we also include for that resource to be provided.
There's a good website, c3teachers.org, where you can go. I'll say it in the microphone. There's a website, c3teachers.org, that we can go to see how some of the lessons are put together with inquiry guidance and the data sets. Yeah, you can put in the grade level, and there'll be the different examples from geography, history, all different areas. So
Free resource.
yeah, it's a free resource. There's a blueprint for creating the lessons. There's all sorts of resources that are available. So that's kind of the direction I'm going, the main direction.
Peggy McCandless, University of Utah. There's, Jennifer, many of them that I would probably put another tally mark by.
I was just like, if it was going to be your thing, I was like, I'll tally mark it, but we'll go around and kind of rank order these of priority and then have a discussion is what I'm thinking. I'm sorry. Robert knows I kind of just do my thing, and so I will put me to work. So go ahead, Peggy.
Yeah, that's great. From talking to a lot of elementary teachers, one of the biggest things I see in the core is that we need more rigor in the K through 2. And to, like several have said, formatting that and having that, the standalone kind of, this is kindergarten, this is first, this is second, this is third, instead of calling it integrated. Secondly, I have a long list, but I'll take my turn. I'll get 2 in this time. I know that there's a strong civic engagement in a lot of the core currently. I would encourage us to really emphasize that. I think learning things are great, but applying things are even better when we get to apply what we've learned in a real setting. So if we can incorporate that stronger, I think, in our K-6 social studies curriculum, that would help our students to really understand what it means to be civically engaged and what all of this content means. So.
Can I add on that? Because I feel like in that, yeah, I was like, add on
I'm so sorry. That's where I just feel like that engagement in kids in their homes, when they can translate that when they're younger, then that's a great build on to the next civic outside of their home engagement.
especially for those younger guys.
Wendy, Division of State History. So a lot of the concepts that I put into the Google Doc, I think have gotten some good discussion, and I won't beat on them again, but I'm aware of the national concern about the devaluation of social studies, and it's just getting edged out and edged out and edged out, especially in the lower grades. And that's kind of the reason I put that 45-minute marker in there, not to become a policy, but to become like an idea that people might even strive for. And particularly as I read through the K2 standards, I thought, well, no wonder there's not very much in here for those grades. It's much more outlined in the older grades, but I agree with what you have both said so nicely about younger kids are capable of understanding this more than we're giving them the opportunity to make connections between the social studies and the lives that they lead in their homes, in their smaller communities. My child's kindergarten teacher did a fabulous activity called Kindergarten Airlines that was all about connecting the local to global, and it was totally age appropriate. So the more we can encourage those kinds of connections and maybe consider, again, I'm totally cognizant of teachers feeling completely overwhelmed, but if we don't offer them more in the social studies standards in these lower grades, we're going to continue to not get very much. And so I guess it's a little more of the kind of the thinking behind the 45 minutes. It's not meant to be a stick, really, but at least it puts it out there, you know?
Before you start, can we just see, are people able to hear? Can you just ask, are you able to hear? I'm just trying to be aware. You can't talk.
The question.
I'll repeat it.
Okay. So I have a fourth grader who his teacher required him to memorize the capitals of the states.
Yeah.
But I have an eighth grader who was in fourth grade now, who's like learning all about anyway, she doesn't know the capitals. She never had to memorize those. And I'm thinking, isn't that like memorizing your times tables? You know what I mean? Like knowing.
Yes, and then you forget the 7s and the 8s.
Yeah, but at least you know, because I've seen her struggle with her history, with the Battle of Trenton. Well, where's Trenton? Oh, it's in Delaware. Do you know what I mean? Like, and all making those simple connections, like with geographic locations that they really, aren't they required? Isn't it like to me, that should be like a giant brushstroke.
Well, I think what he said about patriotism, that comes under that, and knowing where you live. And the geography part of it, I think if we can come up with something like patriotism, that is that overall brush of where everything else can fall under. And it is in the social studies, I think that would help us then get more detailed with how we can implement that into the standard, whether it's learning the states.
I just was curious. I thought that was standard to
So I'm
have this
going to
memory.
say that there's both, again, standards and curriculum.
Right.
So that's an issue.
Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Like, for example, in Utah, fourth grade, many students do a county report. Why do they do a county report? It's not in the standards. They do a county report because there are 29 counties in Utah, and there are about 27 kids in the classroom, and so it's easy to right? Now, the reality is that we want students to learn about localities, but what we'd really like is a more authentic standard might be something like students will identify a community and make a presentation about the economic development possibilities, the tourism possibilities, in a real authentic way. As if, like, let's say I'm trying to persuade you to build your Dannon yogurt factory in Box Elder County. Well, what does Box Elder County have that Grand County doesn't? So there's an authentic assignment that's better than just make a county report. Okay? The question is often about what we value and what we don't at the granular level. I don't know I know a lot of states because I traveled all over, right? And I know a lot of counties. I don't know all the capitals. I'm the social studies specialist. I don't know all 50 capitals. No, but I also know where to go to look for them. I know how to find out that information. And if I'm curious about that information, then I'm going to want to go there. So it's kind of like always trying to figure out what's essential and then what's not essential. Because there are going to be other people who are like, you mean to tell me you can't name even 10 native tribes, for example, in this state or in this country? How is that not patriotic? Do you understand? I mean, you have to understand that our confirmation bias, our frame of reference, is always going to inform what we think is essential. That's also where the parent will have to come in as well to say, you know what, this is stuff you need to know whether your teacher is teaching it or not. You're going to learn you're going to learn the capitals.
So then that leads to the supplement, like a parent supplement, like this is not in the standards, this is not going to be taught, and if you want your kid to know it,
Secular schooling was never designed to be a standalone anyways. Unfortunately, we have too many kids without parents.
Background. And so you have to learn how to know where to get information, and that's the standards to me are to tell us, these are what we need to have to set the curriculum, which is then where the teacher comes in and says, this is where you'll find it. But
So I love that, except for I'm not going to have my second, third, fourth grader just jump online and have them say, go and find X, Y, and Z on the internet. It's not going to happen. That's where prescribed solid content, I think, would be a good as far as integrating technology into this K through 6. Maybe I'll go there for just a second. That's where we integrate it more is in the 5th and 6th. But as far as K through 4, I think a brushstroke would be provide some of those resources in the class. As a standard, have the teachers provide some of those because I don't want my kids going out and just doing independent searches at that age. They're just, they don't have the...
Well, and the nice thing is there are lots of ways that teachers construct very safe ways for kids to do that kind of independent research. And Wendy could do a tutorial on that, so, yep. All right.
Go back. Okay, so I'm not sure how to word this into a standard, and kind of some of it's already up there, but the formatting, can we be more specific about, can we say we recommend using the K through 2 format or the 3 through 6, whatever it is? Several people have mentioned the K through 2 one. I personally would recommend the K through 2 one. I like how they use, although I wouldn't, sorry, let me walk that back. Because they do the standards and then they do the strands. That was confusing to have two different, but I like, I'll say what I like. I like that they use the culture, the citizenship, the geography, and the financial literacy. I feel like that gives some different categories for them to, especially the teachers, the curriculum, the writers, all of that coming later to format and to structure and to say, okay, we can integrate culture into our English assignment or, whatever. And so along those lines, I hate that they just dropped financial literacy after 2nd grade, which is hilarious because how much financial literacy does a K through 2 have anyway?
So let's say that in a positive, because here's the
right. I would like to see that
done before the other. The mandate for financial literacy was after these standards were built, so K2 is actually done later, so that's why it's there. And so then you would say include a focus on financial literacy K6.
Sorry, I didn't want you to write, I hate that. No. So what I was going to say is let's add financial and it's hard to tell in the 3 through 6 what else they dropped, because there is some citizenship stuff, there is some geography, but I didn't see any financial literacy. So that one specifically, I think that needs to carry on, especially considering that is specifically listed in the graduation requirements. I think that's really important, and that's one of those things that's not necessarily a core, but can be taught in math or in their classroom books or that they're doing or whatever, easy to integrate into those things that are happening. But that would be my first recommendation, is to put that back in cohesively, with the formatting.
Diversity of content, with those headers or similar headers, because
right.
You don't want to strong arm the committee too much, but if you're like, we like having this diversity of representation as the K2 has, that would be a good recommendation.
Right.
Can you give me the headings? You got culture, civic.
There's culture, citizenship, geography, and financial literacy were the 4.
Similar to, and that allows them to say, okay, we want this kind of diversity of topics across K through 6, but it sounds like K2 is built differently.
Yeah.
What we liked about 3-6 is it's grade specific versus K2 is like, somebody teach this.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is we want grade level standards, so it's really clear of who's responsible for teaching what across this diversity of topics.
Yeah, so it's like kind of a mix of these 2 formats, but it needs to be consistent. Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Are we going to go back this way?
I want to say Alice. Yeah. Oh, did you want me? I was just wondering. We'll let Peggy and Alice pass. Okay.
Just to add on just a little bit, it might bode us well to look at that profile of a graduate. Like you just said, Jennifer, the board would appreciate if we looked at financial literacy. Maybe some of those strands could be taken right from that portrait of a graduate.
Nice. That's a good idea. That would be a great recommendation. I will put it up here.
I was just going to ask if maybe like the patriotism would go under what she's saying and add, like, even though it's not necessarily simplifying, but it's adding another thing that we definitely want teachers to teach. So, and that could then indicate what curriculum they would then use or to teach that. Is that
right? Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to, so just so you know, between the time that these standards are made and then the other standards are made, we now have the new format for standards is a strand and then standards. So within a specific strand are specific standards. So the possibility would be is that we would think about these areas of concentration, that those would be possibly main strands, and then the writers could look at weaving that in within specific standards. So for example, in 7th grade Utah Studies, there's a strand that might be looking at period of time, significant change between 1847 and 1896 between statehood, right? Within that, they may have a strand that looks at the history. There may be a strand that looks at the geography of the area. There may be a strand, or a standard, sorry, that looks at the economic development from the 1840s to the 1890s. And so each of those standards references that concept, right? So I think it's doable to kind of think about it in terms of getting at, regardless of whether the exact format will be the K2, it's kind of weird. Sometimes some people have to see a table one way, and some people have to just flip it, and then they get it, right? So the formatting can be tricky, but the intent will be there. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Well, what I thought, shall we start another round here of any other recommendations, and then we can. Okay.
I've got 2 things. The first one is I like the idea that we need to connect social studies to language arts and to math, but I want to make sure that we don't take it out completely, that we also teach it as a separate subject. And the other thing that I would like to see happen is that we focus, as well as the content, that we focus on skills for the students, so that we we give students the skills of young historians and young geographers, and that they learn how to do the subject as we do this.
Can you give an example, like a geographer, what skill are you thinking?
So instead of saying the students will understand that, mountains and rivers and things prevent transportation, or that cities are located around mountains or around rivers, that we have students will show us that students will tell you why you need to have a city built here. What are the components that they need to build a civilization there, rather than just, I understand that you've got to have a river and you've got to have access to things, so that the students really do the work, and that they talk about it, they analyze it, and they actually go into the maps instead of just looking at the maps. Does that make sense?
More questions on the student end, like trying to understand why.
Yes, or not just questions, but that students use the maps. They use the atlas. They learn to use latitude and longitude. They work with the tools that a geographer would use. That they use GIS. That they do all that stuff, rather than they just learn about it.
So okay, that helps me understand when you say skills.
Okay.
Norma's got, let's just check. Do ask if anyone has a specific recommendation they want to add to our list?
Go ahead, Brenda.
Do you want to wait?
It's like really hard. Oh, there's people in this computer over there.
So one of, I would say what I feel like is really important to add to the core curriculum or to these standards are sections, or integrate somehow more Indigenous studies in a purposeful way. I see how there's attempts that have been made, but I strongly believe that, and this comes because I'm a Native American, and also because I'm a teacher, and also I've worked with a lot of Indian Native American communities and Indigenous communities, and we seem to be, our studies of Native peoples seems to be put into a small Native American unit, or put into November. And we are a greater part of history than most people, or many people, would choose to think that we are. And I know that there are many, many states that are looking into being more purposeful when it comes to integrating Native American history. So I'm not advocating for a unit. I'm advocating for infusing how in place-based learning and geography, that all students need to learn that here in Utah you are on ancestral lands, and that our children should know that, because that is the beginning of history here in Utah. I'm also feel strongly about when we talk about government and the Constitution or democracy or republic, that we, like you said, look at the hard facts, that how we were able to come to where we are today. And there has been some colonization that has not been beneficial to all people. And so I feel very strongly that those are the places where stark revisions need to be made throughout the whole K through 6th. And so anyway, that's what I'm thinking. I feel like there should be greater partnership with tribes in setting out the standards. And this is, the reason why I say this is because the way the standards are right now and the way they're taught, we continue to reinforce stereotypes of Native people. When we don't talk about treaty rights and sovereignty, we still get questions or confusion about why some students, and I have to say, my daughter, we have to pay for her education, but even teachers don't understand that there are some treaty rights. There is money because of treaties between the federal government and indigenous tribes that give us certain rights. We don't, not ever, and even today, there are still many people who think that Native Americans get a free ride to college or get free this or free that. None of that is free. We paid an important cost for some of those things that we have. And I really think that unless we address those in our core curriculum, we're going to continue having stereotypes and not having a true and accurate record of how history was made here, and especially in Utah. And I understand in third grade they talk about, you know, the U.S. history and different tribes in the United States. I give presentation after presentation in the month of November. And I can tell you from kindergarten all the way up to third grade, you ask a student, have you ever met a Native American? And none of them, every school, I think every presentation, there have been kids who say they've never met a Native American. And then you ask them what makes a Native American. Feathers and buckskin. And this is 2019. We should be past feathers and buckskin. What makes a Native American is that our ancestors lived here on this land, and that there are important things that happen to them that every student should know about. And so I don't say this because I'm, you know, I don't say this out of ignorance. I say this because I've experienced it as a teacher and also as a community member and also as a presenter of Native American subjects to students and asking questions and helping them. I think our standards are lacking in helping to help our students learn about indigenous cultures and the impact on their culture and the impact on overall dominant society has been. Case in point, Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark are they would have never been able to be successful with the charge that they were given by the U.S. government if they did not take on indigenous ways.
Guides, they actually had guides.
Their guides, their clothing that they wore, the trails that they took, we think that they forged new discoveries. They were actually indigenous trails that Lewis and Clark marked out. The canoes that they used, those were patterned after the different tribes that they met. And so Lewis and Clark would not have been, but what do we see in Lewis and Clark? They're the heroes, but who helped them to become who they are in American history? It is the indigenous people all along the trail that they met. And we never learn about those things. And so for me, the biggest thing that I see that needs to be done with our standards is we need to revamp them so there is an infusion of the authentic and accurate history of how we came to be here in this land. Right now, we're on ancestral lands of the Ute and the Northwestern Shoshone. At this time, when it's snowing out here, they would have been prepared for winter. Where we sit, our state capital, and I don't think that our students recognize that. I think they feel like they just, came here, with the pioneers, and I know that's a great, wonderful part of history. But still, I feel like there is more that our students need to know to enrich their whole understanding of the human narrative.
Thank you. And so I want to see if we've got, do we have this captured, Jennifer? Can you see if, Brenda, if we can get that captured? And then Deborah is on the phone. So I'm going to have Deborah speak in a moment. So Deborah, I'll let you, the floor will be yours in a second here, okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. 1 second. So does this work, Brenda, at this point, this idea of a stronger integration of Native Americans throughout the standards, not one unit of study? I'm not sure if that's quite.
So I think for me, and I know I speak from this because it's very personal to me, I would bold that, and I would underline it, and I would put 10 exclamation points after each one.
But he captures it.
And I kind of think between those two ideas, I mean, it's hard thing to articulate in writing, and Robert being here will be helpful as he works with the committee.
Yeah.
But the opportunity I tried to take was to represent your ideas in a succinct way. Due to the fact that the board has to rebut some things. So.
And I like that because I think it incorporates some of the K2 and what we see later on where we talk about immigrants and refugees and people that are displaced for whatever reason, whether it's from colonization or from war or from, there's 100 different reasons, economic reasons, famine reasons. There's a million reasons why people get displaced. And if they can find themselves in the history, then they get passionate about it. And so I think finding ways, and maybe this is an overarching sweep so that we can find some of those connections with the individual students to help find themselves in history.
See, but that's the thing about patriotism. It's how it applies to you. If it's in a vacuum, it doesn't mean anything. And that's part of it, but there's actually, I guess my concern is that you're not wrong, but there's an enormous amount of information that's just as valid as yours. And so at some point, you got to decide how much you can give, you know what I mean?
Especially if they're not teaching it yet.
Yeah, making it individualized to the students so that they can see themselves in their own circumstances in their transition from their home, as they get different orientation, whether they're moving across the country or their ancestors moved from here to here, were displaced for one reason or another, then they'll have that connection.
I think
Great.
my passion in this is such because I would hope that all teachers would be able to share this kind of understanding with students. But time and time again, I've seen that once we're put into this 3-week unit, and they learn how to make a dream catcher, or they learn how maybe they learn a couple of Navajo words, and then maybe they watch a Native American dance, and then they call it good. What I'm asking is, I really feel like if it's written into the core curriculum, then there is greater understanding of it, and I feel like it is something that needs to find its way up to a priority.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have Deborah speak. She's on my phone, and then we'll go from there. Deborah, you want to say hello and give whatever recommendations you'd like to add? We'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Hello. I'm wondering if you can hear me while I'm on speaker, or should I put it on close to my mouth? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So I just was I'm wondering if the revisions that we requested and put onto the Google Doc, if that document will be forwarded to the writing committee.
Sure.
As well as the notes from this meeting.
Oh yeah, you bet.
Okay, so in addition to the notes that I wrote or submitted, I've noticed that state state law or state code mandate certain things be taught, and most of them are met in these standards, but there's just a few that aren't mentioned. And so I just wanted to suggest that they be put into the standards to meet state code. The first one is that learning the different forms of government, such as republic, a pure democracy, monarchy, and oligarchy. And also it talks about, or it requires, state code requires that we have political philosophies and economic systems mentioned or taught, such as socialism, individualism, and free market capitalism. Now, I did find free market capitalism mentioned in the 3 through 6 standards, but the others were not mentioned, socialism or individualism.
Okay.
You repeat that one.
Socialism and individualism. These are, so the recommendation is, basically it's
So I don't need that specificity.
revisit,
Really
revisit the state,
ensure that
revisit,
state
make
code
sure,
requirements are-
So our recommendation will be
That's better.
ensure that state code requirements are included in the standards. And we've got this note, yep, so that's great. Thank you for that. I appreciate
I think it could be put into 6th grade standard 1, objective 3,
Yeah.
but the writing
Well, that's-
committee decide if there's somewhere else.
it. Right, yep. Thanks. Deborah.
Also, it says that we need to talk about the national motto and the national anthem, and neither of those are mentioned. And maybe these could be IEs or something, examples to use, because it also, the code says we need to use Utah Supreme Court decisions and acts of our Congress, the United States Congress, and United States treaties, and I couldn't find any of those mentioned in the standards as they're written now.
Sure.
So most of the state code is met. I highlighted everything that was met, but those things that I just mentioned are not mentioned in the standards, but are state code.
Great, thank you.
And then I would like to know if there's how we will get the revised standards. If people on this committee, how and when might we have access to the revised standards after the writing committee is done?
So so just for everybody, that's the process that I've outlined, like the 12-step process for revision process, is that once the writers have a draft available for the board for initial review, the board will look at that and determine whether it's available then for 90 days of public comment. So then you have 3 months to go through standards, fine-tooth comb, and give whatever comments you want to make, and then what happens from that is that then the writers...
So we would then take the stance of public commenter and not current committee group, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And is there any, when they get the revised, when the state board gets the revised standards, will they also get a list of parent comments or recommendations from this group that weren't put into the revision, so that they know at least that they were suggested?
We don't repeat that part in public.
Yeah, no, probably not.
Feedback.
Yeah, what would happen then is you would look, so then what would happen is you would look at the standards and you would say, wait a minute, I'm not seeing this or that. And then in your public comment, that's when you would make the comment. And then the board would say, oh, wait, that's not there, or this isn't here, or that's, we don't care, or we love that idea, whatever they say. So yeah, it's just, otherwise we get mired, and so we just try to keep moving.
So the writing committee, is that a committee of volunteers?
Yeah, so the writing committee is people who volunteer their time and expertise, and
Deborah, for the sake that we have 23 minutes left for this today, can we do specific process questions with Robert offline? We're really focused on getting these recommendations down, if that's okay.
Right, so my last comment would be a movement to have another meeting so that we're not trying to cram 60 pages of comments into the last 20 minutes.
so do we have, I'm happy to, here's the thing, we have 2 meetings by statute. I've only asked this committee to meet twice, and we want to try to make a recommendation to the board. Again, this is the beginning process. I just want to reiterate, it's not the end process. This is merely the beginning of the conversation. So are there recommendations that you want to make specific for the writers or for the board in terms of a charge for moving forward?
I think what I'm hearing is there will be no more meetings, and if I have more comments, either write them in or say them verbally now before 1 o'clock. Is that how I understand that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I can be done talking now. If something comes up in the next 20 minutes, then I'll either submit it that or on the Word document.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks.
My thought, just as we're talking, this might be more of a format thing rather than a standards thing, but what I see is that we want our students to know past, present, future, history, how we can apply it, what we can do to learn from it, and we also want to know specific dates and times and how that applies. One thing that I've learned in my own personal study of history after public education and college and everything, I didn't start getting into it until I started realizing things are on a timeline. And I never learned that concept until I was an adult. And so I think it would be really good if somehow in the implementing of these standards, whether it's all the way through K through 6, that they go in order of time events. And that would also include, indigenous peoples. It would include wars. It would include colonization. Everything from the beginning of time. I think we talk a lot about, more just America, but does K through 6 also include a world view? So if we begin with the beginning and we go to now, how can we do that in a way that makes sense to the children and they can see their place in it now and what the future might look like? So I think if there's a timeline sort of an implementation that you start with, where you are, but learn about you're here in the world, and we have an earth, and we have many countries, and we have, perhaps that's where we start, and that might be reinventing the wheel again. I don't know, but.
Well, I mean, a recommendation might be to attend to the importance of chronology.
Yeah,
right?
Chronology, sure.
The chronological understanding is definitely an important.
And then figuring how to implement that for each grade.
And do it in lots of different ways, but.
Yeah, like maybe do it like a K through 6 and then start over again through the middle school, and so that they get it again, but start at their grade levels and move up. But I think that they really are capable of knowing and understanding like stories of how the indigenous people lived here, and even in kindergarten. So I think the rigor along with timeline, those are just some more of my comments.
Thank you. So this is Wendy again from State History, and I wanted to come back. I'm not totally ready to frame this in thoroughly thought out language, but in the portrait of a scholar, I really feel like social studies has a role to play in digital literacy, because the digital world is how students will experience social studies in their daily lives. And if you're aware of the kinds of messages that circulate on social media that teenagers are consuming every day, this seems to be kind of a natural point of intersection between social studies teaching not just being about, we're going to learn about things that happened in the past, but we are really need to prepare kids to be able to apply social studies skills and competencies to living their lives in the digital world. And I'm not sure really, you're doing a very fine job of explaining that. But I think that's an important way that social studies can link to the portrait of a graduate and is forward thinking. And I'm afraid that a lot of times people write off the social studies because it's all about stuff that already happened, and they are not able to see relevance in the content. I don't suffer from that problem because I find it to be relevant all the time, every day.
But you know what? Sorry.
It's okay. I'm pretty much done.
Okay. See, again, from my angle, I grew up with extreme ignorance. I barely even made it through high school. I fought a lot. Because I grew up with such insanity, I had no foundations. I didn't even start learning about our founders till I was probably 35. But what it gave me is it gave me a reference of how it applies to me, and not only that's why I teach my children. And I see social studies as the tool to teach our children, whether it's indigenous people or whatever it is, how their world applies to them, whether it's finances. The problem is I mean, if we're going to go personal rants, the Federalist Papers, I think our kids should be taught the specificness of the Federalist Papers and how they apply to our Constitution. But you can only teach so much. But the thing is there's a tremendous resources that are, videos, and a lot of it's privately done. But there really are tremendous resources that are well done if they're ferreted out, and those could be included in that. And the problem is we have so many different opinions. Oftentimes, what we call accurate is concerning. So that's my.
Actually, it does get back to the digital literacy piece too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That kind of helping. Yeah. I mean, that skill set is essential.
Well, and there's so much there.
When Ben Franklin talks about a republic, if you can keep it, he's talking about what skill set do we need to have for the digital literacy piece. And I do think, I think that they, again, I'm going to repeat this again. This is the start, okay? It's the start of a fantastic road ahead to think about what we can create together that's best for all Utah students so they can live the lives we want them to live. And so what we need to do at this point is think about and look back at this list, and if there's anything on the list right now that needs to be struck, we strike it. Otherwise, what I could propose is that you allow me to wordsmith it, but succinctly. You have to think about the board gets a binder for every month of their meeting that's this thick. So we need to keep this short and sweet. It doesn't mean that both this recording and our notes and the comments that you've made won't then inform the writers. Assuming the board takes your recommendation and moves forward with the revision, then all of this information, collective knowledge, will then go to the writing, and writers can get started. But just know that this whole process is a constant, recursive. It's like when Churchill talks about democracy is the worst form of government, right? With the possible exception of every other form of government. That what we're talking about here is a very democratic process in terms of creating what's best for kids. So if you wake up suddenly in the middle of the night and go, oh, I didn't mention X, it's okay. There will be time. But there's not time for me in terms of getting these things to the board in a week, okay? So what I need is, I need us to kind of look through this list. And if there's something that you just can't live with as a recommendation, or you feel like it's too much, we can strike it. Otherwise, I'll move forward with writing these into pithy talking points for the board.
Can I make one more?
Please.
That, I don't know. We talked last time about the suggestions and the revisions and the standards being more specific rather than just saying they should have an understanding. Could we recommend that they use, not that I want to tell them what words to use, but to maybe like avoid using understanding and maybe
More specific descriptor.
I just had a word in my head.
Well,
to demonstrate.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean-
use demonstrate instead of
demonstrate,
like,
yeah.
so that there's, you know.
I think what you're trying to get at is if we hew to the definition of a standard as a demonstration of proficiency, you can't use unaccessible or non-accessible
Exactly, using
verbs. We're going to
accessible
use
language.
accessible, measurable language in our whenever possible in our standards, right? All right, so you guys could have dropped the mic after saying revise the standards and it had been done, okay? So you have extra credit. You guys have extra credit.
So I'll just put up, I tried to group them, and this is just my thinking, it may not actually work, and you might totally group them differently, but I needed a way to, like, what's overarching, and then what's kind of just these smaller, finer points. So to start with, there's just commonalities, so that we want social studies curriculum to be about what unites us, not what divides us. And so those opportunities for saying, yeah, we stole this land in some ways, and how do we address that and understand how we can learn from those experiences.
Can we have the word disconnected, how it brings us together and connects us? Because I think there are different things that.
Sure.
There's so many different types of connections that as long as.
And I'll just let you kind of read through
Yeah,
what
so,
they are.
I mean, do we need to read out loud, or can you just, can we
Is it
just
big
read
enough?
You can read it.
Yeah, you can read.
Like if it's not, can the people online see your screen?
Yeah, I think so. What's the view? They can
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Get a copy of this as well.
Oh, sure.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
So with the Indigenous studies, I think it's important that, and I'm not asking that this happen without any help. When you were talking about, we definitely need to have committees or with kind of what he was talking about. Well, I feel the same way with Indigenous studies. You definitely need to partner.
They're going to need resources.
This is just the beginning of like, oh my gosh, we've got so much
standards
to
are
do.
the what, and then we generally do a support tool called Core Guides that then we reference resources and partnerships and things that people can reach out as teachers, because teachers don't have time to go build their curriculum, and there's no product you can buy that's going to be Utah curriculum.
And teachers don't have a degree in social studies in content areas.
We are generalists at elementary at best, so.
Especially American, that's like really.
Right. So we often provide resources in what we call core guides that we say, okay, here's the standards, here's some activities, here's some knowledge building for the teacher, here's some reading material that they can build their own knowledge, because some of these topics, having taught elementary, it was like, I had to teach Antarctica, because at that point, no, Australia. We all had a continent. Everybody had one continent, and I didn't know anything about Australia, so I learned a lot over the years I taught first grade. But having resources to pull from would have been really helpful,
So
right?
Jennifer, are you talking about like the old science core guides that they used to have?
Yep.
Because we don't have anything like that now.
They're building them right now. So, and they, so when we have new standards, Robert will
Love to
then
see
take
that.
that on.
Love
So
to see that.
all of our staff is, so science is new and health is new. They've all are building those.
Will you
core
scroll up
guides.
to the next? I'm going to scroll up to the next chunk. Okay.
If there's anything, yeah, there's equity is the last one here that you couldn't see when I had the other screen. And you might find either ways to group some of these
Yeah,
ideas. I didn't group a whole lot right now. Influence of history, the state code references that Deborah brought up, making sure, and we can just, in the notes, add the relevant code number so the committee will know what to look for. And we can get rid of the numbers, but these just came up at least twice in terms of that inclusivity. I don't think that's as great as it can be, so more of an add. Rigor, the rigor, many of you mentioned that. The academic language, the words, I always say if kindergartners can learn dinosaur names, they can learn academic language. And so using the terms that they need to know.
I know you're going to fix this, but reading that rigor one, that could go either way. Being thoughtful.
I agree.
Learn ideas. We could be saying you're trying to be too rigorous too early.
Yes.
We're going to word that to say they can learn this younger. You know what I mean?
Applying the actual standard for that grade.
I'm going to do that just for,
I'll capture
because I agree with you. Like even when I typed it, I was like, it's not capturing it. We're in the moment, so it makes sense. But
That compared to like health standards, there's some things you don't want kindergartners
Absolutely. We've had lots of that discussion.
Very solid foundational concepts the kids can get in kindergarten. They know about justice. They know what's fair and what's not. When you tell a first grader what's fair and what's not, they're going to know.
They already know.
You know?
I'm going to go to the enhancement section. So enhance kind of that theme of patriotism, the depth of the standards in K through 2 specifically, place name geography, and then skill development kind of bleeds over. So I'm going to try and show you both of those. And you'll probably capture this way better. I'm not a social studies master, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is very much in line with a lot of what thinking about. We want kids to know that what's a historian do? Kids in 5th grade think historians watch lectures, read Wikipedia, write books, but they don't understand that historians are sifting and sorting through the artifacts, writing, both written and nonverbal, whatever, and coming up with an interpretation of why this happened then, or what was that incredible courage of that person, how was it that Sacagawea was such an incredible resource, So yeah, we'll get that.
Oh, did not mean. So this is the integrate section. It's just me saying, kind of bring these pieces throughout through integration.
Do we need to put on there K through 6, or do we need to?
The recommendations for what you're doing is for the entire plan. Yep. We will do them together in one kind of vertical alignment. I'm going to scroll down. I think you've got those ones.
Janae online wants to recommend a format that flows from grade to grade.
I think we're getting there, so tell me if we didn't capture that, Janelle. So this is the format layout pieces, so stronger vertical alignment with a recursive approach, which is, I think, what Janelle's trying to get at, is like having these connection points across the grade levels, so that there's not this isolated effect, but there's this return to these ideas and deepening those ideas.
It's a concept of scaffolding. It's not a hard concept and it's definitely something that the writers can pay attention to.
No matter how thirsty you are, you can't drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's really ultimately when you're doing social studies, we need to teach them how to think and how to discover, like go and learn and read and have your own perspective. We're teaching the skills. I can go look up in Google when an event occurred. That's no longer what we're really trying to help with. We're really trying to help with how did that event impact and influence the things after that as well as today. So, yeah.
I kind of
how
feel
does it
like
apply to this?
Yeah.
And maybe this
The
is
relevance.
something that when you have incorporate or enhance or whatever, like how do they bring it back?
So that's why I like the timeline. It shows where you are in history, and it tells you.
And that's coming. I did represent it, but I'm going to put relevance here instead of value. Like the relevance of how yesterday impacts today and that kind of thing. The active verbs that you brought up, and I spelled measurable wrong. And then additional recommendations, and these are just pieces, and I probably need to put financial literacy in the integrate, but time allotted, like giving that recommendation. The board's not ever going to require a certain number of minutes, but we can put in the document it's recommended this kind of time. We have that for literacy and mathematics as well, so that's not but yeah, like it can definitely be something you suggest. And then this timeline and the attendance to the importance of chronology across. So those are kind of where we landed.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So do you still have your regularly scheduled curriculum directors meetings where all they come? Would you ever say to the curriculum directors, we would like you to have 45 minutes of social studies instruction?
Yeah. And the reason for that is that if you don't build content knowledge, kids don't read as well. Right. You need background knowledge to understand what you're reading. And so social studies is one of those places between using what's happening today and what happened in the past, an opportunity to build content knowledge. If we want to develop better readers and better thinkers, you need knowledge to pull from. And so social studies is that for that.
Curriculum directors would come from the state. Then whether the board ever does anything or not, then these social studies standards.
Well, it'll be really easy when it's in the standards document.
Yeah.
I mean, because we've had this conversation with the literacy director specifically, because literacy is what takes away from social studies. I used to be the state literacy person, so I can literally say that. But it's because people think you have to teach this isolated book to be able to teach speaking, reading, listening, and writing, and you don't. You can teach that all day long. It's just being intentional about that and using the content areas as a way to do that. So definitely an area we keep trying to push, but we can do a stronger push. What I'm thinking, and Robert, you're the lead, so is that you kind of re-verbalize some of these things, see if there's some better connecting points, and then sending it out to you all to make sure it's representing your ideas to what we've come up with today. You already have some other documents he can incorporate, but we can't keep continuing too far, because once the board backup is in, and we walk away and say, I wish we would have gotten, maybe you can still whisper that to Robert and he can work it in, but we have to have a stopping point, and this, honestly, you could do this for a year and be like, but we also need, because it's kind of exciting to know that you're the future of social studies instruction, but we also need a stopping point for Robert's sanity for Christmas break, as well as the board gets a document and they need enough time to review that document to be sure that they took in your recommendations and understand where you're coming from. And we can't constantly give new iterations of that document. So just kind of letting you know the process side. Robert's the specialist and he wants to do what's best for social studies, but I'm going to try and save him from killing himself off. He's done standards before, and it's a lot of work. It's probably the thing that either people come to the state office to do or they leave before it's time because they don't want to deal with it, because it's a very robust process. And you all are step 2 of 12. And so it's many steps to come from here, but these recommendations, I think, are fruitful across many content areas, not only social studies. When I look at this kind of having this opportunity to embed financial literacy, like that can come in a lot of content areas, and a piece that we want our students stronger in. Relevance, all of our standards should consider how is this relevant to me as a human, as well as my community. And so I don't see anything on here the board is going to give a lot of pushback. They're going to be very respectful of your time and your opportunity to take this kind of civic engagement of yourselves in this process and to influence the future of our social studies standards. And like he said, not every little piece may get in like if there's things not represented in the final list that goes out, it doesn't mean they can't still be considered, but the board wants these recommendations. So when they look at the final version of the standards, they go back to those recommendations and they look for opportunities of how those recommendations were addressed. So your recommendations come up front and then they return later when the board starts to look at the draft and say, okay, show us how home connections were made, and we can point out specific examples of standards where that occurred, or how is financial literacy in here. Oh, look, we have a whole strand dedicated to financial literacy across K-6. So it will return, so don't think that it just comes up front, but it comes back on the kind of the further down the road. In about 6 to 9 months, you'll see a draft of the standards generally, and that document will come back out for them to kind of make sure that the writing committee addressed your recommendations, so it's not a futile effort when it comes down to it. Do you want to add anything? Or?
The only thing I want to say is, public education is about, basically when a community is formed, one of the first things that gets created is a school. And what you're doing here is saying, what should we teach kids and what's important and how do we pass on those values so we can prepare them for that republic.
One thing I'd like to say is it's also we shouldn't teach our kids. There are lots of things that shouldn't be taught by
outside the scope of school.
Yeah, right. And that's something they can learn outside of school. So I just want to thank you for your time and for the commitment to this process. And I just really appreciate that this is, again, the start to a road down to some better standards. So, yep. So thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah. And 102, not bad for this. So thank you very much.